So hi, I am Katie Boodle, an associate paper conservator at NEDCC, and I'm here to talk with you today about planning conservation projects, how to get the most out of your treatment and funds, and generally just give you a conservator's perspective of how these projects will be approached. As part of this webinar, you'll also hear about 3 successful projects from state and local institutions that will hopefully help inspire you. All 3 of the institutions worked with NEDCC to conserve their founding documents. So while NEDCC's specialty lies in the fields of paper, parchment, photographic, and book conservation, as well as audio and digital preservation, conservators here are in a unique position as we do not have a single collection that we're responsible for, but rather work with all types of institutions. I'm hopeful that this perspective can help you with your goals when pursuing conservation, regardless of your institution's size or whom you choose to have conserve your objects. So all conservation starts with the examination of the material. Each of these points listed on the slide will affect how or if treatment can be performed, as well as give the conservator some clue into the history of the object. These issues will also affect how complicated or involved the treatment will need to be, and this is then usually reflected in the cost of treatment. There is an order in which treatment must be pursued, and while in some cases objects can be stabilized without addressing all of their various issues, typically each point of damage must be dealt with in their own time. Depending on what's observed during examination of the object, as well as feedback from the various shareholders, a treatment proposal is created. These 5 treatments listed on the left of this slide are the core of paper and book conservation. Other treatments, seen here on the right, may or may not be proposed, but do tend to make conservation more involved. Whether or not they are performed is entirely dependent on the object and the goals of the institution. These are just some common examples of treatments that you may be, or that may be recommended to you, but there are other specialized treatments unique to specific substrates or media that may also be proposed by your conservator. Of course, in order to make these decisions, conservators have to actually see the objects. There are 3 primary ways that they can be given access to the material, and each has their advantages depending on what the object is and the capabilities of the institution. First is to have the material sent to the lab for assessment. Conservators tend to prefer this as we have specialized supports and equipment to better handle the material, and we can also perform more extensive testing on the pieces. This then provides us with a much higher accuracy when it comes to treatment time and treatment cost, and typically the cost of this to your institution is just shipping the material. The second way conservators can assess objects is by actually visiting the institution, and I'll go more in depth in this later in the presentation. This is especially beneficial for high-value items that will not be treated immediately, objects that are oversized, or large collections of very similar items. This can lead to clearer housing and handling strategies after treatment, along with insight into the workings of your institution. Generally, this type of an assessment does require more upfront in terms of cost, especially if you're bringing in a conservator from outside your local area. And the last type is one that is hardest for the conservator. Assessing material through photographs is not impossible, but because the material cannot be tested, treatment proposals and costs are usually more of a ballpark estimate. This can be a good assessment method if you're looking for general preservation recommendations or are trying to determine if it's worth spending some of your preservation budget on treating these specific objects. Usually there is no cost for a quick virtual assessment, but generating a more formal proposal may end up resulting in some expenditure. So regardless of which version you use to actually physically get the objects in front of your conservator, there are 3 questions that you should expect from them to help further guide treatment. The first is, what are your goals and expectations for the piece? The conservator may have to temper what you want based on what they see. Very rarely do materials end up looking brand new after treatment. Conservators will also probably ask you how the object will be used once treatment is completed. This question will help the conservator make decisions regarding the level of stabilization and intervention that the piece may undergo, i.e. what papers we choose to use, whether or not we propose housings, and just generally try and figure out how the object can be accessed by you and your patrons. And lastly, the conservator will probably ask what prior conservation treatment has this object undergone. While this question isn't always applicable or necessary, if you have a prior record of treatment, it can be extremely beneficial for the conservator to get a better sense of what has been done to the piece historically that then needs to be reversed. So knowing a little bit about what the conservator is looking for and how they will approach your objects can help you better plan how to utilize conservation in your institution. And you may be thinking, we already have a preservation budget. Doesn't conservation just fit into that? What's the big difference? So in truth, there's not much of a difference between preservation and conservation, but there's enough of a nuance that they should be considered two separate things that work in tandem. From a conservator's perspective, preservation is working to halt or slow changes with a focus on the environment and housings, and generally has long-term effects. In contrast, conservation is the reversal or repair of damage with an increased focus on stabilization that has short-term or immediate results. So having said that, what can conservation do for you that preservation can't? Because conservation has a more immediate impact compared to preservation, it first can repair the damage to your collections. It can help you generate interest in your institution and draw in your audience if you properly promote that you've been doing it. And in that vein, you can also use conservation to expand outreach and education by using the conserved items as a point of interest and interacting with your patrons. It can obviously help you improve access to your collection by making the material usable again. And finally, it can sometimes help provide funding to your institution. By generating interest or having a unique project, you can apply for grants or reach out to donors that can then turn into seed money for the preservation and conservation of other collections material. Now, I know that sounds like a tall order, and convincing others can be very difficult. But if this is your first conservation project, it's best to find something important or unique that you think you can make a strong argument to your shareholders or granting agencies. If you can't think of something right away, look at events such as anniversaries or other important upcoming dates that are special not just to your institution, but to your state or country, things that you might want to put on an exhibition for. Start earlier than you think, as it can take time to get funding and complete treatment. If you don't feel that either of those options will work to get you started, sometimes having an impartial assessor come in to look at what could be improved on using a preservation assessment grant or PAG can help give you a clear set of short, mid, and long-term goals, which may or may not include conservation. And finally, sometimes the best way to convince others is to show what your fellow archivists and librarians have done with their collections. As I mentioned earlier, we'll see 3 case studies later on, but many institutions are utilizing conservation in a number of ways and sharing it online. So to fully get the right sort of impact from your conservation treatment, you should make sure that you ask the conservator some questions when pursuing it. Some great ones to ask are, can you clarify? No conservator will mind if you want clarification on or comparison between 2 treatment options. Please do not hesitate to ask them, as it can help both parties better understand each other. Communication is key. It's also good, if you know it, to say, this is my budget and my overall project goal. What are my treatment options? Whether it is your first time conserving something or your 50th. It's best to be upfront about your budget if you know it, and your goals with the conservator. Conservation is expensive. We all know it. And sometimes it's just not possible to reach the goal with the budget provided because of things like tape or other secondary materials that cause complications. However, a good conservator can work with you to either find funding opportunities or perhaps dial back the treatment and take a more preservation-based approach. And the last question that might need to be asked is, does this need to be conserved? Now, this may seem like a very strange question. I've bought my piece to a conservator. Of course it needs to be conserved. Sometimes, though, it really doesn't, or it just doesn't need to be conserved right this moment. Sure, we can improve the housing, but actually treating the piece may not be necessary, and those funds that you would spend on conserving a single item could go towards something else or a much larger preservation project. Now, these are just some examples of things to ask, and each institution and object may have more specific questions that aren't covered by these. The important thing is to not be afraid to ask questions, and you should definitely expect them in return, especially when it comes to discussing housing, access, or digitization options. So, what prompts a conservation project, and what else should you think about when working to pursue conservation? First, some of the most successful conservation projects are approached at the right time and when the right amount of interest is present. This goes back to that thing I mentioned earlier about anniversaries or important dates. It's never too early to think about treating something or at least getting a professional opinion on it. Next, the people around you involved in the project are critical for success. Conservation projects are a long-term pursuit in many cases. Having people who are in it for the long haul and understand the nuances of what can or can't be done is extremely important. Obviously, funding and the ability to pay for the project is also important. Think back to the project being a seed to generate more interest in the institution. The initial money has to come from somewhere, whether internally due to timing or outside of the institution because the material is a good candidate for a specific grant. Expanding your options, as well as considering what you'll do if the funding falls through, can help you complete your project. And lastly, but probably the most obvious, is the objects themselves. Finding and prioritizing objects can be very difficult. What makes an item a better candidate for conservation is subjective to each institution and each shareholder. But the object is the focus and linchpin of the project, so it should be something that can be easily encompassed by the previous 3 points. In the vein of picking an object, I want to briefly mention objects that might be overlooked simply because they seem so damaged that dealing with them is impossible. Nearly everything can be stabilized to the point that it can be used in some format, though that format might not be the way you originally envisioned. Conservators want to make the material available, and being able to help you access the inaccessible is important to us. Things like mold-damaged objects or broken cylinders can be digitized or handled in a safe way in order to make them available in a new manner. Now, sometimes we can get so focused on treatment that we may forget about other options that we should try and pursue at the same time. We want to ask ourselves, how will our material be used as we look forward to the future? While considering this question, we want to keep in mind if the funds we've acquired have limitations, such as what they can be spent on, or if there's a cap as to how much is available. Also consider how treatment can build in those opportunities that I mentioned earlier for outreach, education, and further funding. And probably the thing to think about the most is how to improve the accessibility of the material and protect it at the same time. So digitization is, of course, a big point to help improve accessibility and limit handling, as well as expand collections and their outreach. It allows for quick searching and reference, which is highly valued in this digital age, especially now as most of us are online. Furthermore, handling oversized materials can take multiple people and therefore multiple staff members. So having a digital copy can be helpful for researchers when consulting maps or other large documents, as well as just generally being a better utilization of staff time. If digitization is performed in tandem with conservation, it can be extremely beneficial for a number of reasons. First, the material is never going to look better than it does right after conservation treatment, so you get the best quality image possible. Second, it decreases the number of times the item must be handled by anyone. So if it's one of those highly damaged objects and digitized at the conservation lab, it's also handled by someone who is intimately familiar with the nuances of the object. And lastly, if it's something that's getting a specialized housing, digitizing can be formed in between the housing and final treatment stages, limiting the amount of time the object has to be removed from its new custom mount. And speaking of housings, even if you do not digitize, considering them is an important part of the treatment process. It can improve the environment of the treatment object without having to deal with your storage space as a whole. Boxes, folders, or framing increase protection and isolate the object in a controlled and sometimes highly specialized manner. Furthermore, if the material is oddly formatted, such as a scroll seen pictured here, conservators can work with you to build in handling advantages that make it easier for staff to access the object once it's been returned to the institution. Exhibitions are an important part of outreach to the community and access for your materials. Whether they're just a couple of items hung on a wall or a show in a dedicated space, considering your objects and how they can work for you in that setting is important. It allows people to connect with the material in a controlled environment and also provides you the opportunity to showcase some hidden or little known treasures from your collection. By pairing or thinking about how your objects can be displayed at the time of treatment, conservators can work with you to modify the housings, provide specific environmental recommendations, and just generally advise on other issues that may arise during exhibition. Adjacent to this physical space is a digital exhibition, if you will, such as a blog post about the treatment and history of the piece. These take less time and money to do, but can still reach a wide audience and showcase things going on in your collections, even if the physical material isn't on display. And the last thing to consider to protect the object, but also still be able to use it, is a facsimile. Facsimiles can provide physical access to an object in a safe way, and due to the newer nature of the paper or other substrate, they tend to be easier overall to handle, even at larger sizes. They can be a very beneficial part, an interactive part of an exhibition if your substrate is not a standard paper or if you want to showcase something specific. Nowadays, what's available to print on archivally has expanded greatly, even within the last few years. Facsimiles can also be a good way to show a before of the item if it is severely damaged. By utilizing Photoshop to perform digital restoration, imaging staff can provide a cohesive and visually coherent object that might otherwise be unattainable. By creating a facsimile during treatment, the print can be color corrected against the original objects in various light with the most accurate representation of your material possible. So with all these things to think about, we should look at what funding sources are available to us and what types of proposals we can get for our objects. Now, some institutions are large enough that they have a preservation budget or other internal sources that they can use to fund conservation projects. Even some smaller institutions may have a fund that they can pull from. But for those that don't, looking at funding sources that are state or regional specific, such as state preservation grants, or material-specific grants, such as those for Asian art or religious organizations, can be crucial in pursuing treatment. Institutions can also look to their community either through community funding, such as the Community Preservation Coalition, or through crowdsourcing, either digitally or in the manner of traditional fundraising. When considering your options, you should take into account if the object that you've chosen fits better for one type of funding source or another. When it comes to specialized funds in particular, being able to make a strong case as to why you should be funded is key. Now, when applying for grants, you want to make sure that you have these key features kind of down pat. Each funding opportunity requires something a little different, but these are some of the broad commonalities between them. Most grants will request that you have a narrative on the object, which includes its significance, its uniqueness, or why it might be in crisis in your collection. They also usually request that you have a budget as well as justification for why that budget happens. You're usually required to provide some sort of institutional information, such as a mission statement or staff resumes, and a completion schedule. Most grants have some sort of deadline or require the funds to be spent within a specific time period. So you want to make sure that you can provide them an accurate time frame in which the work can be done. And lastly, an institutional ID may be required. Institutional IDs are something to be aware of far in advance, as they can take time to apply for as well as get approval on. So if your grant requires it, make sure that you apply for it sooner rather than later. Be careful to meet all of the requirements and to directly answer the questions that are in the application, rather than looping back to previous answers or trying to reiterate an important point in several different sections. Also be sure to be aware of any matching requirements. Some of the larger grants in particular expect applicants to fund some portion of the total cost on their own. All right. Most deadlines for grants fall between the 1st and the 15th of the month, with peak granting season being between December and March. However, July to August is a close second. Some grants are arbitrary in their dates, like the first Monday or the third Friday of the month, whereas others choose to stick with a 1st or a 15th for easy recollection. I've included some very common dates here, but they are not the only ones that are out there. Federal grants are usually higher in terms of what can be awarded, sometimes even up to 6 figures, but there is more competition compared to regional or specialty grants. These grants usually require a bit more information and paperwork, so the earlier you start, the better. As a general rule, starting 1 to 3 months before the deadline will put you in good shape and mean that you don't have to throw something together at the 11th hour. When choosing a grant, consider the funding duration and how long the project can go on. Some funds may be spread out over 2 years, so plan accordingly if you're trying to hit a specific anniversary date. It's also good to note this so you can have treatment completed within the constraints of the granting body, as I mentioned earlier. Finally, you should keep in mind your own yearly budget and the announcement of dates when selecting grants. If you really want the conservation project to move forward at a specific time, choosing a grant that announces prior to determining your yearly budget can really help you make a case for internal funds when the time comes. Also, keep up with deadlines and changes. Grants and deadlines are normally inflexible, but overarching events can change the timelines and the availability of assistance. When the government shuts down, or of course now during a pandemic, there's a possibility that some deadlines will change. However, it's also possible the deadlines won't change, but the program officer or IT support are unavailable to help applicants with the grant or submission. All in all, it's best to be ahead of schedule and be prepared as far in advance as possible. So to get conservation started and to provide an accurate budget for your planning, you have to get a sense of what needs to be done and how much it will cost. This is where we turn to getting the material in front of the conservator in some manner. The terms assessment and survey may be used interchangeably by the conservators or preservation specialists that you contact. What both terms mean in this context is that an individual, either conservator or preservationist, is coming to your institution to look at your spaces and or your collection to provide recommendations. Assessments are meant to be general, though some types may provide more targeted information than others. Out of an assessment, you can receive a set of goals and priorities, a time frame for how quickly the work should be done for the safety of the collection, and even a ballpark treatment proposal or cost. They can be extremely helpful for planning out both small and large projects. While you'll usually have to pay for the time, travel, and report writing of the visiting professional, there are grants that can cover the cost of some assessments, such as the Preservation Assessment Grant. You can also look at an assessment as a cost saving or more strategic spending measure if you need to sell it internally, as the recommendations for priorities might not align with what you originally thought. So you might be wondering, what exactly are my assessment options? NEDCC has a handy summary of the broad types of assessments available, but other institutions should use similar terms and provide similar outcomes for their assessments as well. Obviously, any grants that are more preservation focused are going to provide long-term recommendations for preservation and may provide a general condition of a sample collection of materials, but won't necessarily recommend what conservation needs to be done. Things like a collection assessment or a item level assessment is where you'll start to see those specific recommendations when it comes to the prioritization for conservation treatment or digitization, as well as possibly what sort of a ballpark cost estimate for conservation treatment or digitization might be available. For collections level assessments, we're going to be looking at things overall in a broad scope, whereas an item level assessment would be every single piece within the collection. So, and then at the very far right, you'll notice we have a conservation treatment proposal. Now there's some variety in these as well, depending on if you're looking at a single or unique set of objects versus batching treatment of very similar materials. So the assessments I just discussed can help you figure out what your ballpark number might be, as well as what type of proposal you want when the time comes. There are two broad categories for proposals, a single proposal or a long-term contract. While there are other nuanced proposal types available, these are the two umbrella categories, if you will. Both have drawbacks and advantages and drawbacks depending on the project scope. Questions to consider are, do I have a specific set of material or completion date in mind? How much of this material do I have? Do I want to spread out the cost over several years? And what are my own internal procurement procedures? Looking at a quick comparison of these two proposal types, generally a single proposal will be highly detailed and focused, acting as a first step in conservation, and it's good for smaller item count projects. So if you have, say, less than 10 or less than 30, it can also be used for planning or granting purposes on smaller scale projects. In contrast, a long-term contract will usually provide something more along the lines of a generalized treatment and cost, which is beneficial for collections with established preservation budgets and are looking for large collection works, as well as being able to spread the total cost and work out over several years. The last question that I mentioned earlier about the internal procurement procedures is perhaps one of the more complicated ones to answer, as it varies from institution to institution. As such, I want to briefly mention a couple of things that can be a limitation in the procurement process with regards to conservation, and then provide some solutions to get the most out of your proposals. So first, conservation is highly specialized. Not to say that other things aren't, but procurement is built for services and materials that are easily compared and are generally just more prevalent. Conservation has some nuances to it that don't translate as easily to the procurement process, as it is based on each object or set of objects. And this sometimes limits the ability to properly assess the materials. Some requisition protocols prohibit any sort of prior knowledge and don't allow any photography to be included in the requesting paperwork. As I mentioned earlier when talking about virtual assessments, it won't prevent an assessment of the material, but it may result in multiple modifications to the treatment proposal afterward. Communication between the conservator and whoever is hosting the RFP, RFQ may not be with the archivist or person who deals directly with the material on a day-to-day basis. While it's essential to the procurement process so there is one single point of contact on both sides, it's important to make sure that the person answering the questions understands how the object will be used and what treatment can do for the object. And lastly, sometimes the conservator's recommendations may be outside the scope of the request. The proposing conservator may want to include housing or digitization if they think the piece is particularly inaccessible, or alternatively, they may not think that the object needs to be treated or specifically treated in the requested manner. Probably our most common example of this is not thinking that an item should be postbound. It's important to be able to communicate and negotiate these things if possible. So to get the most out of a proposal request, especially if you have to go through the RFP, RFQ process, you should consider the following points. Provide clear pictures of damage. If the assessment has to be virtual, the more photos you can share, the more helpful it is to the conservator. You should communicate your goals clearly with the procurement office and the conservator if you're able to. Everyone has some level of expectations for what the state of the object should be in after treatment. Saying things like, I just want it stabilized, or I'm hoping to reduce staining and improve its appearance can really help guide what's then proposed. You should also consider the long-term life of the object. Thinking about all of those things that I mentioned earlier can really help you get the most out of your money, and will hopefully provide you better ways to serve you and your community. If you're able to allow in-person visits, you may get less inquiries with this or people who don't want to come see the material, but those who take advantage of the opportunity will be able to speak with you and assess your needs and the needs of the collection in its environment. And lastly, it's important to remember shipping containers and the cost of shipping things. This may seem like a very silly or minor thing, but shipping can be a hidden cost that people don't always think about at the funding stage. So if you can get a ballpark number for this, it can really help you plan ahead when it comes to sending the material away. Sorry. Okay. All right. Now I want to talk about, sorry, I am missing one of my images. Now I want to talk about 3 specific projects that approach the conservation of similarly significant material. All 3 institutions had different goals, obstacles, and utilized conservation in a way that worked for them and the objects. The institutions worked with conservation staff at NEDCC to look beyond the treatment and to provide access and outreach within their community. The 3 projects are the conservation of the Alabama state constitutions, the South Carolina constitutions, and the Great Deed of Billerica. To begin, we have the 6 Alabama constitutions and their ordinance of secession. So conservation for these documents was prompted by the state's bicentennial, which occurred in 2019. The Alabama Department of Archives and History was lucky in pursuing this treatment because they had the support of the state's legislature. The state had even established a bicentennial committee to not just oversee this project, but other celebrations throughout the state. While the star of the show was certainly the founding Constitution of 1819, the archive knew that this might be their only opportunity to address the other constitutions, some of which were in much worse shape than the 1819. They wanted to pursue treatment of all of them to not just show Alabama's origins, but also its changes through history. To obtain a proposal, the archive had to go through their purchasing office and have a formal call for proposal requests. The material was examined at the archives rather than being brought to a single conservation lab due to the high value and uniqueness of these items. During the on-site assessment, discussions were had to get a sense of what the archivist's goals were and how the material would be used after treatment. After assessing the material, it was found that 4 of the constitutions were very similar in terms of format, while 2 were bound, and the ordinance was a full parchment skin. For the treatment portion of this webinar, we'll just focus on the 4 similar objects. The constitutions had several issues, but one of the more challenging aspects was that they were in a scroll format and between 20 to 45 feet in length and varied in width from 10 to 20 inches. So essentially they were very long and very narrow. While most of the parchment skins were of similar thickness and quality, there were a few outliers within each scroll. The skins were attached to one another with either a protein-based adhesive, ribbon lacings, or a combination of the two. Both methods had multiple failures, causing the sheets to separate from one another and put stress on the ribbons or the parchment, respectively. In some instances, the seams had been repaired with a significant amount of pressure-sensitive tape. On top of these mechanical failures, the constitutions had iron gall ink that showed flaking media. So the constitutions were treated by first consolidating the text with a combination of gelatin and ethanol, and any secondary materials such as tapes were removed mechanically without the use of heat or solvents, as those would damage the parchment. Silk ribbons were reinforced as necessary, and the seams were reattached using an adhesive that was meant to replicate the original material. Areas of torn parchment were mended with Japanese tissue paper and gelatin. The last step of treatment was to construct a housing that could be used for long-term storage and support the materials during the 2 exhibitions that would occur to celebrate the state's bicentennial. This method, seen in the photo, utilized a housing method that is commonly used for oversized materials, being rolled onto an archival tube. This rolled mounting was then suspended in an archival box to best protect the object. Upon completion of treatment, the constitutions were returned to the archives for their We the People exhibitions in Huntsville and Montgomery. While this was the primary showcase of the material, the archive also had smaller events that were covered by the media, such as Descendants Day, that promoted not only the objects, but also the archive. Archivists also created a number of resources for the elementary classrooms within the state of Alabama. The archive coordinated with NEDCC staff to have a video of the treatment of the documents playing during the exhibition, and a section of the exhibition catalog that covered the treatment. The archive was able to do a significant amount to celebrate and make the most of the funding available to them, but none of this was done overnight. The archive began planning for the bicentennial 5 years out, with the request for treatment starting in year 3. Staff also had a very clear idea of what they wanted and were open to NEDCC's input on how they could further utilize the options available to them. So next, we have the 7 South Carolina constitutions, which were a mix of paper and parchment materials. The treatment of these materials was not prompted by any sort of anniversary or other significant date, but rather purely their condition and unique nature. The paper items had been barolaminated and were splitting or losing parts of the tissue lamination layer, as you can see here in this picture and under magnification here. Barrow and his lamination process are very intricately tied into the history of conservation at the South Carolina Archives, as they actually purchased one of Barrow's machines during the peak of his treatment and laminated much of their paper collections. Barrow lamination has its own controversies, and its removal is expensive, hazardous, and a very complex treatment process. This limited the archive's options for which labs could treat the material, as well as increasing the cost of treatment. Much like the Alabama archives, they had the material assessed in their own spaces so they could control and protect these high-value items. Unlike the Alabama archives, when the South Carolina Department of Archives and History was going through their state legislature, it took nearly two years of the archive being on a waiting list to get approval to pursue treatment. Because of the conditions and issues of the 2 substrates, paper and parchment, are so different, I want to approach their condition and treatment in 2 parts. As I mentioned, the paper materials were barolaminated, with the exception of 1 constitution from 1868. Some of the constitutions also had media solubility issues, so strategic applications of the solvents that are used to remove the lamination and controlling how the objects were treated aqueously had to be performed extremely carefully. The constitutions also had significant losses and tears, as well as some that had been purposefully cut in more manageable ways for the lamination process. In some cases, the paper had lost its sizing and was softening overall. To treat the constitutions, the barrel lamination was removed in 3 successive solvent baths that consisted primarily of acetone. Washing in filtered water or a combination of ethanol and water was then pursued as deemed necessary by the media. Some of the media was tested for iron gall ink corrosion, but all were found to be stable, at least in that regard. Papers were then sized as necessary to help add further strength and flex. Tears were mended with Japanese tissue paper and fills were inserted with an appropriate material. In the photo here, you can just see how the treating conservator has aligned the chain and laid lines of the fill paper and historic paper to create a smooth transition between them. In cases where there were severe breaks and losses in the paper, it was lined overall with a lightweight Japanese paper for better support. The 2 later constitutions, the 1868 and 1895, were both previously postbound, so they underwent encapsulation and had new custom-sized post bindings created. So earlier in the presentation, I showed a picture of an inaccessible parchment object. This was one of the South Carolina parchment constitutions. It had been severely mold damaged to the point that the skin was powdery and weakened and was losing pieces of itself every time it was touched. On top of the powdery substrate, we also had extensive flaking media, especially in the mold damaged areas, that had not been completely eaten away. There were significant losses in the upper half, both to the text and parchment, but surprisingly, the lower part of the document was in good condition, and a significant amount of text was present. You can see the level of damage that could not be addressed in this after treatment photo here. As such, the primary goal of treatment was to stabilize the constitution so that it could be digitized and accessed by researchers in that manner. The treatment would be ended by constructing a more rigid housing and one that would not have a static charge like the object's current encapsulation. As it was unable to be handled in its previous format, the document was interleaved, collated, and then carefully separated. The inactive mold was removed with sponges, as a HEPA vacuum would put too much stress on the weakened parchment and possibly remove the fragile text. The text was consolidated with a 1% gelatin solution where needed, and weakened areas were reinforced and realigned with Japanese tissue paper only to the extent needed for the object to be able to be handled by NEDCC's imaging staff. It was at this point in treatment that the piece was then digitized leaf by leaf. Afterwards, the constitution was rebound as before, using new comparable materials rather than the historic ones due to the extent of damage that they had endured. The entire document was then placed in a sink mat and suspended in a sealed package with non-reflective and anti-static UV acrylic. Since the goal was to improve access and deal with the damage, the other things that the archive considered during treatment was how to make the housings work for them in the long run and provide access to researchers. The 1861 Constitution that I just spoke of was not only digitized, as seen on the right here, but also slightly retouched in Photoshop for increased legibility of the text. And there were facsimiles printed as a physical access copy of the individual leaves. These leaves were then placed in L sleeves, folded and boxed so they could be used in person by researchers if there were details that they needed to see. And they could also be brought out and be shown with the 1861 in its sealed package if needed for exhibition purposes. Likewise, the other housings were customized with an emphasis on handling and temporary display. Many of the paper constitutions, except those that were postbound, were secured to secondary backing boards. On the left, we see the 1776 Constitution with its protective tube that's used to prevent researchers from folding the pages over too much and protects the large seal at the head of the document. Lastly, we have one of the oldest documents treated in this series, dating from 1654, the Great Deed for the town of Billerica. The town was building a new high school, and they wanted to have a mural of the deed digitally reproduced in one of the conference rooms. The deed is stored in the town's archive, but the town clerk and the local history librarian were responsible for investigating the feasibility of this proposal. Upon actually viewing the deed and its housing, they both agree that they should see if it could be improved upon. Furthermore, only black and white copies of the deed were available digitally, so they knew at the very least the object would need to be digitized in color if the high school wanted to use it. To fund this endeavor, they knew that they would be able to turn to the Community Preservation Coalition, which is a Massachusetts-specific granting program. Billerica is one of the 170 plus communities statewide that participates in this program. A limitation of Billerica's community-specific committee, though, is that they do not consider digitization a form of preservation for historic objects. As such, the library and high school would have to pay for that portion of the treatment by themselves. Because of Billerica's proximity to NEDCC, the document was brought to the center for an in-person evaluation and photo documentation that would be used to complete the proposal. The deed was not left due to its importance, but because the conservator could see it in person and take photographs of specific problems to jog their memory, the complications that usually arise with virtual assessments were mitigated. As a single parchment document, the deed had perhaps the least amount of conservation work out of all of our case studies, but it did provide some interesting challenges. Billerica's Great Deed was signed and sealed by what could be considered a who's who of early New England Americana. With the numerous seals combined with previous treatment, there were some very interesting issues that needed to be addressed. The deed had also survived a significant number of disasters in its time, including a fire in the early 1920s. The damage on the deed had been previously addressed at least once before, and the repairs were done made using a comparable parchment. In most areas, the repairs were only visible on the verso or not at all. It was only under close examination or noticing the abrupt cutoff of a signature that alerted the conservator to the fact there was more of this document that was replaced than initially believed. The deed was also very loosely stored in a leather portfolio. While the portfolio offered some protection to the document, it was damaged and warped, and when opened, the deed was left completely unprotected. So with all of this information in mind, a very minimal treatment plan was put together. Seals were consolidated with B72 to stabilize any breaks and reattach loose pieces. As taking all of the historical repairs out may have only slightly improved the distortion of the deed, it was eventually determined that they should not be removed for several reasons. First, they were technically historical repairs and spoke to the life of the deed. Second, due to how long they had been a part of the document, they begun to work in tandem with the original parchment, moving far past the stage where one was overriding the nature of the other when it came to environmental changes. And finally, their removal and replacement would not improve the overall appearance or assist in reducing undulations in the document, as the seals and voids in the lower half would inhibit the ability to stretch and flatten the document in any way. Therefore, minor tears and areas of detachment around the historical repairs were stabilized. The deed was tension mounted using the Japanese tissue paper method seen in this photo, and it was sealed in a double-sided sealed package before being framed and boxed. The deed's housing was created in such a way that the prior housing, which you can just make out right there, could be stored in the lower half of the box. The board that the frame is sitting on is actually a flap that lifts up for easy access. And as a two-piece box, it was also equipped with a magnetic drop-down edge on one side for easy access and removal of the deed. Both of these aspects were important to the library and the town clerk's office to showcase the history of the document when it was accessed by researchers. The digitization of this piece, seen here on the right, was also enhanced per the request of the client to mimic the interior of the original housing. That's that bright red backing you see. However, the shadows in the photo were added digitally as the edges of the original leather portfolio inhibited the imaging staff from taking a photo that met their quality standards. 2 copies of the facsimile with the recto above and the verso below were printed from this and framed in a double window mat. These copies now hang in the Billerica Public Library and the Billerica High School's 1654 conference room for the public to view and enjoy as a piece of their town's history in a way that they might otherwise not be able to experience. So if you're interested in hearing more treatment details or just to get some inspiration for your own conservation projects, please visit our website to read some of the stories we have posted there. Links to the funding sources and other helpful material that I mentioned earlier is also present on our website as well. Now, I know that was a lot of information and we have quite a large group today, but I'd like to open the floor to any questions you might have, and I'll do my best to try and answer as many of them as I can in the time we have left. If I don't get to you, or if you have a question I can't answer at this time, please reach out to me via email or phone using the contact information here, and I'll speak with you more in depth or direct you to a person on our staff best suited to answer your question. All right. Anybody? All right, so Sam is asking, this month is Black History Month. Are you aware of any grants or funding specific to the conservation of artifacts important to this history? Or someone maybe I could ask. So I do not know any off the top of my head, but I can certainly direct you to someone in Pres Services. I think the only ones that I'm thinking of are maybe tied to the historic Black colleges. But I feel that those sorts of grants would definitely be things that are of a good candidate for funding if you can find some. I believe we have everyone's contact information, but if you want to send me an email, I can pass you along to one of our preservation specialists. So Grace C is asking, is there a ballpark length of time between a request for an assessment and a proposal? So I can only speak from experience here at NEDCC. Depending on the size of the collection that's going to be assessed and whether or not it's an item by item assessment, or if it's just like an object or two, certainly will increase time. Also, whether the assessment is in person or if it's physically brought here. I know at the center, we usually try to turn around any estimates for proposals within a 2-week period, if possible, though sometimes it can take a little bit longer if we're waiting on information from the institution. Collections level assessments, item by item level assessments, we do try to get out rather quickly, but I would say that those are between 3 to 4 weeks, depending on what else is going on. If you do have a specific deadline that you need a proposal by, though, you should tell your conservator and let them know that you are trying to hit it by this specific date. But it really does depend on, exactly what type of assessment you're doing and how many objects there are. So Joshua is asking, can you speak more about Japanese tissue paper? You mentioned it for use in restoration, but can it also be used for facsimiles? So there actually are some Japanese paper, there are some types of Japanese paper that are available to print on. Actually, there's an archival kozo that our imaging staff will print on if requested. It's a little difficult to compare the two because the Japanese tissue paper, when used in conservation, is used for repairing tears, whereas for facsimiles, you can certainly use it to repair the tears in a facsimile print. But based on your question, I would assume you mean, can you print on the Japanese tissue paper? And the answer is yes. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Yes. I do not know all of the substrates that you can print on off the top of my head, but I know we internally have printed on various types of Japanese tissue paper in order to get the correct sort of translucent effect to match the original object. We've printed on cotton as well as some other textiles to mimic the original support that something might have been drawn on. But yeah, if you can print on it and if we can find an archival version of it, it can be used. So Dee is asking, where can local conservators be found? So hold on, let me just type in the link. So we usually recommend that people go to AIC, which is the American Institute of Conservation. Their Find a Conservator page. I'm going to link that in the chat box here. Any conservator on this list is going to be someone that has gone through the accreditation process with AIC, which is our governing ethics body. And so they've had their work reviewed by fellows or other conservators. They've had their reports checked out, and they've basically gotten kind of like an approval by the governing body. And so that would be the easiest way to find a conservator in your local area. And I believe you can search either by name or you can enter a postal code within a certain number of miles, as well as a specialty. So if you're looking for a furniture conservator rather than a book conservator, they'll be on that list. All right, so I'm just going to give it another minute if there's any last questions. And if not, then that's fine. As I said, please feel free to reach out to me at the information that's listed on the screen, or if you have a collections emergency, please feel free to reach out to the hotline number that's listed there as well. I'm glad everyone enjoyed it, and I will, I guess, talk to you all later.